What system requirements does Linux have? In general, Linux can be installed on practically everything. Whether the system we want to install has 16 or 32 megabytes of RAM and a Pentium 1 processor, it can run Linux. It might be an installation with a simpler graphical interface, like TWM or Fluxbox. It will not be pretty or colorful, but it will be stable and efficient enough to run all its basic functions. If we want it to look pretty, handle new devices, perform complex multimedia functions, then we need to deliver appropriate system resources. On identical machines, Linux will run a little bit faster than Windows. And it has an interesting function, namely no performance degradation over time. Everything depends on the type of work, the applications themselves. But the Windows environment, because of its many necessary services, which we do not necessarily use, requires more resources. The Linux work mode, depending on the graphical environment, has greater or smaller requirements. Minimum requirements are relatively low, and the environments for the recent KDE requires 2 GB of RAM. LXDE and XFCE require 512 megabytes and run smoothly on 1 GB of RAM. We mentioned performance deterioration over time. It happens because the Windows entire system configuration, application configuration, is stored in the registry. The registry swells over time, and even if we uninstall some applications, the registry will contain holes, which were used by the entries of some previous application. The Linux system has no such thing. A given configuration is read directly by the application, only when it's needed. The Linux system has the same performance, regardless of if it's 5 minutes or 2 years old. It's a great advantage, and you don't need to reinstall the system just to clean it up. It shows up when we experiment, like to switch applications, install, uninstall. It's a problem that does not exist in Linux environments. How much space does Linux take? Less than Windows, maybe a little less. Windows takes up a lot of space because it needs to duplicate its DLL libraries, save configuration files in multiple places. The full Linux, together with most commonly used applications, takes up 8 to 10 gigabytes. Not a lot of space is needed. If you want to install a resource-hungry application, some game of a very advanced graphics pack, we need to allocate additional space for it. Also, the Windows swap file takes up an extra 2 gigabytes of space. The total amount of space is a little less than in Windows' case. Windows 7 takes up about 14 gigabytes, plus 2 or 3 gigabyte swap file. Linux clocks in at half of that. It's not such a great problem nowadays because disk space is cheap these days. It can matter if we want to install an operating system on the newest SSD drives that are relatively small. So in these cases, system disk usage can matter. The Windows system differs from Linux in that in Windows, if the C drive is running out of space, the system will lose stability. Linux does not have that problem. The only problem might arise if we want to write a log of system actions. The system will run out of space and will not be able to write the data. It will not stop working. It will simply not be able to complete its task. The system can run with 5 to 10 megabytes of free space to write temporary data on. Unfortunately, the biggest problem are the drivers. The problem originates from a certain lack of involvement from the hardware producer's side as far as Linux compatibility is concerned. Hardware compatibility has to be taken care of by the kernel creators. They did it for most of the hardware. The average hardware you'll find in a computer will be supported instantly. There may be problems with some non-standard devices like modems. There's also a problem with graphic card drivers from ATI or NVIDIA. Nevertheless, both companies supply binary drivers. Drivers, unlike in Windows, are certain fragments of the same system kernel. So the drivers created by the community are spread automatically with the system, so there's no need to install them. Many producers do not supply drivers because they come with the system. In some cases, when the need to install drivers arises, they'll be in alternative repositories, places to store software, or they can be downloaded from the producer's site. This is the case with NVIDIA graphics cards or ATI graphics cards. In the case of some scanners, printers, or devices that are simple in the way they're constructed, there's a need to install those drivers with the so-called firmware, which is built-in software. Theoretically, every device should have the full software in it. The driver should serve only to give the firmware instructions. Unfortunately, to reduce costs, many devices like Epson scanners are devoid of the repository to cut costs. In this case, the driver has to write the appropriate software onto the device on startup. Unfortunately, such software is usually closed, which means that it has some patents protecting it, or licensing restrictions, and cannot be supplied with the Linux system. We can use the Windows drivers to provide functionality in those cases.